There's not a lot that can frustrate me, especially in the world of video games. Gaming is supposed to provide a challenge, the kind of obstacle that feels really great to overcome. But sometimes, victory just isn't worth it. As a source of frustration, standard enemies are by far and away the worst manifestation. If you think about the worst boss fight you've ever come across, regardless of how irritating or disappointing it might have been, it's only there for a short moment, limited to a one-off appearance in most cases. Normal mooks, not so much. If a developer was evil enough, they could fill their game with the most diabolically designed enemies ever conceived, and there'd be nothing you could do about it. Enemies are intended to stop your progress, which in itself is pretty aggravating, but there's a distinct lack of fun about dispatching some of the more infuriating obstacles out there. You're the hero, you should get off on this. You should be filled with a sense of responsibility and be proud of the actions you're taking. I want to be taking down giant titans, not swatting mosquitoes. If you apply force to a moving object, you're going to have some kind of influence on the direction of said object. That's probably some law of physics, I don't know, I didn't pass that class. But when this becomes relevant in the world of video games, it's not usually for a good reason. You can be speeding through a Sonic level with some crazy forward momentum, but the slightest interruption will bring you to a grinding halt, regardless where it comes from. Really, any enemy in Sonic is annoying to some degree, but the slices from Sonic 2 push things a little too far. Someone at Sega knew what they had here, because it feels like the slices are carefully positioned in Sonic 2 in order to achieve maximum irritation. Most Sonic enemies work the same as stage hazards. They might move around a bit, but their main attack is their existence. Some Bright Spark decided that the slices need to shoot their claws like boomerangs at Sonic. Doing so will leave them vulnerable, but the likelihood is that you'll be too busy picking up rings to care. Special mention to that one slicer in the third act of Metropolis Zone who's just waiting on the edge. That's a dirty move, sir. Won't stand for it. Rock, paper, scissors is easy. Not really to win it, practically based on luck and maybe some body language, but to understand it takes maybe 5 seconds. Pokémon, on the other hand, is one part common sense and one part learning all the ins and outs of what type is super effective against what. But even when you get that down, there's loads of ways to get an upper hand with status effects rendering type disadvantages something you don't have to worry about. Combine rampant usage of these status effects with a wild Pokémon that turns up with frightening frequency, and we have a recipe for some outstanding grievances. Zubats are the Pokémon world equivalent of real-world flies. Not particularly robust, but fast, annoying, and common enough for their presence to be the source of a lot of discomfort. Sadly, if you find yourself in almost any cave in all of Pokémon, there's not a lot you can do about the Zubat epidemic. They're fast enough to get the first hit in, and if that hit is Supersonic or Confuse Ray, that are specifically designed to turn the battle into a luck-based test of patience, good fucking luck with that noise. You're literally going to need it. You can take a lot of the problems associated with Zubat and Pokemon in general with a pinch of salt, since you can just buy a lot of repels to keep them away from you, but if you're in a position where you need to stock up on one specific item to keep one specific enemy away from you, you've done something wrong. Does anybody else remember when Gen 5 didn't have Zubats in their caves? They were the glory days. The more I play and think about Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, the more holes I find in it. Maybe I should just leave it on a shelf and remember it as the perfectly imperfect game that never got finished, rather than make the holes big enough to drive a car through by digging too deep. In one of the first missions in the game, you're introduced to the Skulls, a group of enhanced super soldiers that are clearly capable of borderline supernatural talents. They can keep up with you when you're on a horse. You don't want to mess around with this. But of course, they wouldn't be here if they didn't have some significance in the story, and inevitably they turn up later as an obstacle that you need to get through. Look, I know you've got to make them this inhuman otherworldly force, but could you tone it down a little? I don't care how genetically modified they are, any enemy that can take this many bullets and do so much damage in return is putting story importance ahead of the gameplay actually being fun. Which is hilarious to me, since the Phantom Pain in general put gameplay on a higher pedestal than story. Seems weird that this game would go to such lengths to focus on gameplay and yet put something like the Skulls in there. Mr. Kojima's version of fun is a little different to everyone else's, and that's why we kept coming back. Enemies in RPGs don't tend to fall into the category of being annoying, since the way the experience is handled means that you can just grind to your heart's content, but ever so often there's one or two enemies that stand out and transcend the mere difference in levels between the enemy and the player. You know, most times when an entity is brought back over and over again within a franchise, it's something to be celebrated. You're modifying the series as you go, but you keep some things the same to give players a sense of grounding. A kind of, hey, I remember that. However, apply this to something that no one likes seeing again and you're creating a different experience entirely. I can't think of too many people who are glad to see a malboros from one Final Fantasy game to the next. Basically, if Zubat is somewhat of a glass cannon, because bats can be cannons now, malboros are simply one great big mounted gun. The crux of the problem comes from their signature move, Bad Breath, which takes the issue brought up by Zubat's status-inflicting moves and laughs at it. Instead of just confusing, Bad Breath can inflict more than one status effect on anywhere between one and all party members depending on the game, and can cripple an unprotected party in no time at all. Supposedly they're due back in Final Fantasy 15, but I don't think anyone would mourn if they didn't. You can only take so much punishment. Zombies are famously uncomplicated enemies. The worst that they could do is move a bit quicker than a casual stumble, but even then, Half-Life 2's fast zombies aren't immune to 10 cc's of bullet. Usually zombies exist as an outlet for mindless fun and something you feel full of lead without feeling bad. But The Last of Us doesn't follow this philosophy. In this game there's a few steps to the progression of the infection. Left exposed to the fungus that zombifies someone for a couple of years, and you start to look a lot less human. Almost like your face is made out of popcorn. There's some creativity behind the clickers since the infection has gotten so bad that they've actually gone blind and see through echolocation, but since they're a more advanced version of the zombies, they've also become a lot more aggressive. So much so that you're as good as dead if they get close to you. Their hearing might have poor range, but you make the faintest of sounds when you're near them and you won't stand much of a chance. Really, the only way you can take them down is either using melee weapons or Molotov cocktails, but neither are really efficient when dealing with lots of them. Pretty much you need to have a shiv crafted for the off chance that you run into a clicker. If you don't have one, then I hope you like throwing bricks around. It's a special kind of entertainment. When I first played Pikmin, I was shit scared of it. I like to think a lot of people were, since the act of overcoming odds as daunting as find all your ship parts within 30 days while building an army of vegetables and avoiding all the deadly wildlife don't fill you with a ton of confidence, but you strive on in hope rather than expectation. The time limit was relaxed in Pikmin 2, so you had less to worry about, but they also made one of the worst enemies in the game even more of a dick move. Bulborbs are the enemy type chosen to represent the hostility of the Pikmin series, but a slight variation, the Spotty Bulbear, is where the real fun is had. You always feel vulnerable when in charge of your Pikmin, and as a part of this, you tend to approach enemies with initial caution so you can scout out the threat. The Bulborbs are relatively easy to deal with since they start off asleep and stick to a distinct patrol route. The Spotty Bulbear doesn't do either of these. I don't know where the energy comes from since they aren't nocturnal like other members of the same species, but they will happily go for a wander to whatever location they like. And should they stumble across some of your Pikmin, it's like a vacuum cleaner. And, hilariously, the Spotty Bulbear even has the ability to revive itself if you kill it and leave it alone for a while. This kind of talent works fine for smaller enemies, but not for one as threatening as this. Hard to imagine that in reality, an enemy like this is about the size of a large orange. A particularly evil orange, though. Mario in the 2D games is quite delicate. You might think yourself strong since you got access to all these power-ups, but regardless how powerful you think you are, you're only ever 3 hits away from dying at all times. So not only is level design crucially important, enemy design is very significant. I've never enjoyed fighting Hammer Bros. There's not the same kind of fun challenge that you get from something like charging chucks or the satisfaction of stomping a Goomba. Hammer Bros has the act of confronting enemies reduced to almost random chance. Sure, you can waltz up to them with a fire flower and roast them from a distance, but even then, the arc in which they throw their hammers can make it hard to get close without taking a hit. Pair them up with another one and it's a test of how big your testicles are. Make them home in on you or put them underwater like in Lost Levels and we're veering off the path of having fun again. When you're gonna run out of hammers, you can't have an infinite supply. I'll just wait here, I've got time, I'm a patient man. Not that patient. The moment The Legend of Zelda took the plunge into the world of 3D gaming, the way that some parts of the franchise were handled changed forever. Naturally, an extra axis opens up more opportunities for exploration and puzzle solving, but another big change was how combat was handled. The Iron Knuckles in Ocarina of Time are honestly one of my favourite enemies from any game, not only because of their complexity and how well they use the environment around them, but because they made a fight with a giant ironclad monster enjoyable. There's a lot of annoying enemies in Zelda 2, but holy hell, the Iron Knuckles in this game are pulling their weight big time. I'll usually appreciate good enemy AI, but the Iron Knuckles are aggressive in the way that you can't really prepare for. The Daira set the tone early on, but the Iron Knuckles are a whole different ballgame. Weirdly, the issue here is their defensive capabilities. They're designed in such a way that they'll block your attacks with alarming regularity and retaliate accordingly. Since you get so few chances to hit one, you've got to be equally concerned about your defense, and letting your guard down will leave you in a world of hurt. I doubt you can take a sword swing from someone this big with any dignity. Iron Knuckles, like most enemies in the game, come in different varieties based off colour, but they're also one of the few enemies that have 3 different colours. By the time you find a blue Iron Knuckle, you're having to deal with its sword beams. Don't give this monster ranged attacks. Why would you do that? NES games are hard. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that, it's pretty widespread knowledge. And actually, if you need proof, the last 3 enemies on this list, including this one, have all come from NES games, so clearly, we're dealing with the epicenter of frustration in video games. This was the era where difficulty was a means of getting more playtime out of a game, so you can bet anything that developers wouldn't hold back with the dickish enemy designs. You probably wouldn't get too many games with something like Castlevania's Medusa heads in them nowadays. I really feel like these guys stuck to the design brief on annoying enemies. Medusa heads aren't hard to kill. You can dispatch them with one shot from your whip, but their behaviour makes them one hell of an obstacle. Oddly, they move on a very predictable path. The word I'm looking for is a sine wave, and the first time you encounter them, you're given plenty of time to observe how they move through the air. However, as soon as you combine them with anything more than an uninterrupted line of platform, do their true colours grow brightly. While you might be able to telegraph their flight path with them in isolation, putting them alongside platforms that you need to jump to, or worse yet, that one corridor later in the game with those axe-throwing knights, and you need to devise a strategy to deal with these relatively simple enemies. Every time you move, you're making it hard to find a safe place to stand, but you have to keep moving, otherwise you'll never finish the game. Strangely, of all the enemies on this list that I've talked about, I think the Medusa heads are the only one I respect, and think that a lot of thought went into crafting an enemy this deviously aggravating. Says a lot when Medusa's head turns up as a boss fight and isn't anywhere near as much hassle. Divide and conquer, it's the way to go. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The words of Friedrich Nietzsche, and you can trust him because he's got a big moustache. The jury's still out whether this phrase still applies to modern life, but interestingly enough, it has some significance in the world of RPGs. Think about it, if you don't die in battle, you're probably gaining some sort of experience and slowly becoming a formidable opponent. That is until you play Elder Scrolls 3: Morrowind. The blessing in this game is that unlike Oblivion and Skyrim, Morrowind enemies don't scale to your level, so you can grind all day if you like. But when confronted with an enemy like the Cliff Racer, this won't help one iota. Listing off the problems with these things reads like instructions on how to make the most annoying enemy video games have ever seen. To such an extent that the fact that they're flying enemies in a 3D environment is something you can almost gloss over. Although, maybe it isn't. The combat in Morrowind isn't terrible, but when you've got a Cliff Racer on your tail, then it shows its weaknesses. It is so hard to hit these things with melee weapons, not impossible since they will die eventually, but it's not the most dignified sight. You could shoot them with arrows, but apart from the 3D space making it a lot more aggravating when they're not actively tearing lumps out of you, it also takes a really long time to get results. Since Morrowind doesn't have a fast travel feature, if you want to go from A to B, you're almost always going to run into Cliff Racers. The smart plan is to try and ignore them, but my god do they gang up on you quickly! And the cherry on top of this structurally unsound cake is the noise they make while in your presence. I assure you it's the stuff of nightmares, not because it's frightening, but because it'll consume the darkest reaches of your mind while you sleep. you'll never escape. This has been RabbidLuigi, and the Cliff Racers have built up such an infamous profile that the modding community has done some truly hysterical things to them. There's naturally a Morrowind mod that removes them from the game, but there's also one that I recommend you try at least once, which makes it so that for every Cliff Racer killed, 2 more take their place. And frankly, what can you say about that other than Hail Hydra? Hey guys, thanks for watching. I've been looking for it all month, but I finally managed to make a video that doesn't spoil half a dozen games in the process. I mean, I'm pretty sure this video didn't spoil anything. Let me know if it did, let's keep everything civil here. Anyway, if you want to support the show, feel free to check out my Patreon where I've been explaining how I write these videos. Mainly just mashing a keyboard with my face until I like what I've written. It's worked pretty well so far.